Romsey is a small town a few miles to the northeast of Southampton and was the home of Romsey Abbey, a Benedictine convent founded in the 10th century. Romsey Abbey had always attracted women of high social status, particularly in the period after the Norman conquest, and in the late 1400s it was still attracting women of wealth. Medieval convents were self-governing within the oversight of the church, with the bishop being required to visit each religious house on a regular basis, either in person or by sending a representative. And records of these visitations provide a window onto monastic life through the voices of individual monks and nuns. The period from the 1470s to the 1520s is particularly well documented for Romsey Abbey and suggests life at the nunnery was rather more interesting but perhaps less edifying than one might imagine. In 1472, Dame Elizabeth Brooke was elected Abbess of Romsey, apparently with no objection. But 6 years later, in August 1478, the first signs of major trouble emerge when she resigned, thus triggering the election of a new abbess. The election was not straightforward, but eventually, about 6 weeks later, the nuns re-elected Dame Elizabeth. Nuns of the Benedictine order were given the courtesy title of Dame, equivalent to a monk being addressed as Dom. Dame Elizabeth was re-elected, but the bishop withheld the pastoral staff. In other words, she did not have the bishop's full backing. In effect, she had the responsibility of running the abbey, but not the authority with which to do it, a very difficult position to be in. It's likely that the bishop was not happy with her re-election. It soon became clear why Dame Elizabeth had tried to resign when she prayed to be absolved of the crimes of perjury and adultery. It's quite possible that the adultery had taken place before she was a nun and that she had committed the perjury by not admitting to it earlier. Some 14 years later, in 1492, a visitation of all monasteries in the Diocese of Winchester was carried out, and it's clear that all was not well at Romsey Abbey. Each nun was asked to make a deposition to the bishop's representative, so we begin to hear individual voices. Hervise Hainaut said that the lamps were not kept, and this was by fault or negligence of the sextoness. She also accused the abbess of spending money on drink that she should have shared amongst the sisters for special occasions, anniversaries, etc. Dame Agnes Harvey complained about the beer. She also claimed that one of the abbey servants fed his horses in the abbey's ploughed places and meadows, indicating her rural roots and her understanding of rural ways. But these were not the most damning accusations. Dame Elizabeth, the abbess, confessed that she owed the great sum of £80 to her steward, a man by the name of Tabuk. £80 was indeed a vast sum. The requirement for a knight was an annual income of £40. Dame Isabel Morgan, the prioress, and second only to the abbess, reported that the abbess favoured Tabuk too much, and several other sisters wanted Tabuk's associates to be driven from the abbess's house. Money was also being misappropriated. Dame Ellen Tork claimed that 20 marks donated for the repair of the Chapel of the Blessed Mary had been squandered by the abbess. But if the financial affairs of the abbey were in a sad state, the spiritual health of some of the nuns was also suspect. The prioress said some of the nuns frequented taverns and went into the town without leave. Dame Anne Rose claimed that the prioress did not observe divine services or hours, by day or night. Dame Joan Patton made it clear she wished to be distanced from dealings with Tabuk, and she complained that she had no suitable confessor, and that people stand chatting in the choir. Some 8.5 years later, in 1501, there was another visitation, and matters had got worse rather than better. We hear Hervise Hainaut again, and on this occasion she testified that the roofs of the chancel and of the dormitory were in decay, so that if it rained, the nuns were unable to remain in the choir during divine service, nor in their beds, and that the abbess was not expending funds on these matters, but squandering them on Master Bryce, the chaplain of the infirmary. But other sisters went further in their allegations regarding Master Bryce, and claimed a great scandal had arisen between him and the abbess, accusing them of bad and suspicious behaviour. It would seem Master Bryce had replaced her steward to book in the abbess's life. But Dame Elizabeth was not the only one accused of enjoying more secular pleasures. We hear again from Agnes Harvey, who claimed that Emma Powers was guilty of incontinence with the vicar of the parish church. Dame Emma had had an interesting history, having been professed at a priory near Derby, then had moved to a priory near Hereford where she had been prioress, before moving to Romsey. Perhaps this was not her first liaison. Perhaps the most serious allegation made by the sisters against the abbess was that, along with accomplices, she had broken into the chest holding the common seal and used it to authorise expenditure without recourse to the chapter, and that the money thus acquired was being squandered on Master Bryce. Dame Elizabeth Brooke died soon after the 1501 visitation, and the sisters elected Dame Joyce Rose as their new abbess in May 1502. And although Dame Joyce was elected unanimously by the nuns, it seemed she was not up to the job of turning around a house that was obviously in need of a strong and able leader. There were further indications of troubles when, in 1507, the Bishop of Winchester, Richard Fox, felt it necessary to send a number of reprimands to Romsey. These included an admonishment to Abbess Rose to behave better in the observance of her religion, to avoid conversations with secular persons, and to refrain from drinking and eating to enormous excess, especially at night. She had previously been the kitchener responsible for presiding over all the cooking for the community. We hear again from Agnes Harvey, as she is told to abstain from the society of priests and to amend her former defects. The ills of Romsey were by no means unique or even unusual. How well a nunnery was run depended entirely on the woman in charge. Some abbesses and prioresses were good, competent women, others were unscrupulous, others simply out of their depth. Visitations to 16 convents in the Diocese of Lincoln in the mid-1400s suggest that there was little amiss in 12 of them, and the complaints recorded there were all for very minor matters. But in 4, the problems seemed to be as great, if not worse, than they had been at Romsey. The Bishop of Lincoln's visitation to Littlemore Priory near Oxford in 1517 shows how bad things could sometimes get. The prioress there not only had a child, but had sold some of the priory's property to provide her daughter with a dowry. The impression that emerges from these visitations is very much of two groups of nuns. There are those who appear committed to their vocation, who believed in the life they were leading and were genuinely pious. Others, it would seem, preferred the tavern and the company of priests. So this begs the question as to why girls and women entered religious houses. It's difficult to answer this question directly, partly because it is so difficult to identify individual nuns and their families, but it is sometimes possible, as in the case of Hovey's Hainault. In 1506, Thomas Hainault, Lord of the Manor of Stenbury on the Isle of Wight, died leaving a will in which he bequeathed his sister Hovey's 26 shillings and fourpence, describing her as a professed nun at Romsey. It's interesting to note that the legacy was to Hoveysa in person, not to the convent, although as a nun she had taken a vow of poverty. One answer to the question as to why young girls became nuns is that if a suitable husband could not be found or an adequate dowry was not available, then a convent life was the only option. Dowries were generally paid to enter a convent, but they were often smaller than that needed to secure a husband of acceptable status. Not being married for a woman of remotely noble birth was not an option. A second answer lies in the fact that a religious life offered a woman a level of education and independence not easily available outside the nunnery. The records of the election of Joyce Rose in 1502 list 26 sisters, of which 11 held an office and 8 were assistants, showing that a high proportion of the nuns held a position of some responsibility. So a convent life gave a woman the opportunity to hold a position of authority and independence not available to her outside. Abbesses were arguably the most powerful and independent group of women in pre-Reformation England, and indeed for a long time afterwards. Romsey Abbey was suppressed in 1539, and in the list of nuns given at the time of its suppression is the name of Agnes Harvey. She had been at Romsey longer than anyone else, for at least 61 years, so she must have been in her mid-70s, or perhaps much more. One can only imagine how difficult it would have been for her to suddenly be forced to start living outside her community, quite possibly with little or no financial support. There are no records of the nuns at Romsey receiving any pensions, suggesting that the last abbess had resisted its suppression.